Robert A. Durst, the New York real estate giant, is accused of the 2000 murder of his friend and confidant Susan Berman. Pool photo by J.C. Hong. In a Los Angeles courtroom over the past 10 months, John Lewin, the deputy district attorney prosecuting the New York real estate giant Robert A. Durst in the murder of his friend and confidant Susan Berman, has called 17 witnesses to the stand to build his case. On Tuesday, the defense will try to counter the prosecution's narrative and call its own witness Michael Struck, the retired New York City police detective who spent more than 2 years investigating the 1982 disappearance of Mr. Durst's wife, Kathy Durst. The hearings are being held under a California law that lets prosecutors or defense lawyers take testimony from witnesses 65 years or older and in danger of dying before a trial begins. All the testimony has been videotaped, but there is no way of knowing how much will be used at trial, which is at least a year away. Mr. Durst is 74 and frail, and worth $100 million. His defense team plans to question Mr. Struck about every step of his investigation, which did not turn up a body, identify a crime scene or result in charges against Mr. Durst. That would seem to undermine the prosecution's case in Los Angeles, which is based on the idea that he shot Ms. Berman in the back of the head at her home in Benedict Canyon in 2000 to prevent her from telling the authorities how she helped Mr. Durst cover up his role in his wife's death. The prosecution was touched off in part by the HBO documentary The Jinx: The Life and Deaths of Robert Durst, in which Mr. Durst was heard in the final episode whispering to himself, "What the hell did I do? Kill them all." Of course, Mr. Durst's lawyers contend that the documentary unfairly portrays Mr. Durst as a killer. Mr. Struck also feels maligned by documentary's portrayal of him as having mishandled the original case, according to an angry 2015 email he sent to one of the documentary's producers. Kathy Durst's family is no fan of the detective either, believing that he failed to conduct an energetic investigation into a sometimes violent member of a powerful New York real estate family. Had Detective Michael Struck done his job, Bob would be behind bars for Kathy's disappearance and murder, Mary McCormick Hughes, Kathy's sister, said. "We would be able to give Kathy the dignified burial that she deserved." Mr. Struck's testimony promises to be highly contentious, but Dick DeGuerin, the Texas lawyer who heads Mr. Durst's defense team, said he is optimistic. Mr. Struck's testimony, Mr. DeGuerin said recently, has to do with a 36-year-old investigation that led nowhere, that's been dogging Bob for all these years, although Mr. Struck has been pilloried by Kathy's family and by the former Westchester County District Attorney Jeanine Pirro, who opened her own investigation in 2000, and in the Jinx, Mr. DeGuerin said, "The investigator did a very thorough job, based on his assessment of police records and other materials." Mr. Durst and Susan Berman, after Mr. Durst's wife, Kathy, went missing. The prosecution believes that Mr. Durst killed Ms. Berman to prevent her from telling how she helped him cover up his role in his wife's death. At the time his wife vanished, Mr. Durst told police and friends that Kathy, who was only 4 months away from graduating medical school, might have run away with a drug dealer. "That is the most likely scenario," Mr. DeGuerin said. Still, Mr. DeGuerin has asked the judge in the Los Angeles case to declare Mr. Struck a hostile witness, which would allow him greater leeway in questioning. The defense lawyer cited a 2015 article Mr. Struck wrote for the New York Daily News in which he declared, "Justice has been served at last in Los Angeles with the arrest of Mr. Durst." The McCormick family has never felt that Mr. Struck conducted a vigorous investigation into Kathy's disappearance. The detective never searched the Durst cottage in South Salem, NY, where she spent the weekend with Mr. Durst before she vanished. Compelling evidence regarding Durst's involvement in Kathy's disappearance was uncovered, mostly by Kathy's family and friends, which was submitted to but ignored by the NYPD, the McCormicks said in a recent lawsuit seeking the records of Detective Struck's investigation. Mr. Durst was never named as a suspect in the case. An investigator hired by Mr. Durst's lawyer in 1982, Edward J. Wright, wrote a 3-page memo detailing discrepancies in the recollections of various principals, which first surfaced in the Jinx. The memo mostly recounted Mr. Durst's shifting and contradictory accounts of his whereabouts before and after Kathy's disappearance. In an interview in 2015, Mr. Wright declined to discuss the memo, but he did reveal a telling anecdote. He said that at one point the police invited Mr. Durst to submit to a polygraph examination. Mr. Wright said he asked Mr. Durst's lawyer, Nicholas Scarpetta, who died in 2016, to let him ask tough questions of Mr. Durst before he sat for a polygraph. "Nick realized after my interview that it wasn't prudent to take Robert in for a polygraph," Mr. Wright said. At the same time, Robert was really incensed with me. I was asked to withdraw gracefully, in interviews with the producers of the Jinx, and during a nearly 3-hour interrogation by Mr. Lewin, the Los Angeles prosecutor, Mr. Durst conceded that he had lied to Mr. Struck and other investigators in 1982 not only concerning his actions but also about the state of his marriage. He initially told authorities that his marriage was fine. Decades later, he told the Jinx that the couple's relationship had descended into half-arguments, fighting, slapping, pushing, wrestling. Mr. Lewin brought in several witnesses during the conditional hearings, who talked about violent incidents between Mr. Durst and his first wife in the months leading up to her disappearance. Mr. Durst gave police several versions of what he did the night his wife vanished, most of which were later discovered to be false. Why? Mr. Lewin asked him shortly after his arrest in New Orleans in 2015. I wanted them to leave me alone, Mr. Durst said, according to a transcript of the interview. Who knew that the police would do oodles of investigation and they would look for my motive? A version of this article appears in print on November 13, 2017, on page 820 of the New York edition with the headline "Detective who investigated disappearance of Durst's wife will testify."